Hi, BookTube. Welcome to Sunday. Welcome to Middlemarch Meditation, and welcome to Middlemarch March. The last time we spoke, I left some unfinished business. You won't be aware of this because you can't see my notes in preparation, but I hold them up, and the page that I'm dangling there upside down is the last page I was meant to talk about in the section of chapter 14 where we finished. And I was going to just remark on the farm manager, because Fred Vincy was spared any more time spent with Mr. Featherstone because the farm manager came upstairs. And we know that Featherstone owns a great deal of land, and most likely that land would have been farmed by other people. And his farm manager would have been looking after everything that happened on the one or more farms. I get the feeling that Featherstone owns a lot of land, so he could well have owned more than one farm. And those might have been, and they may have been in other counties. He didn't always follow that the land that he owned would have been within the county he lived in. He might have owned farms far and wide. So his manager was the man who did the day-to-day, traveling around, overseeing things, looking after accounts, but also looking after who worked on the farm and who did not, would be responsible for buying and selling livestock, for deciding what crops would go in the fields, and reporting back any problems or any issues, making sure that the farms remained in good repair, that hedgerows, fences, buildings, etc. were maintained well. Everything that was involved in looking after several farms, and probably underneath the farm manager would have been the farmers themselves, who would have been accountable to that manager, and they would be living, therefore, on rented land, not their own land. Thought I'd mention that. It's just an interesting aspect that Featherstone was still doing business. His farm manager had full confidence to come to him and consult with him. The interesting thing is that Fred is dismissed at that point. Fred, who apparently, if we go by Fred's hopes and Mr. Featherstone's hints, is going to inherit all this land. Why, if Featherstone is serious about giving his land to Fred, why isn't Fred at this stage more involved in the day-to-day business of running and looking after that land? Because otherwise, what experience could he possibly bring to being the overall owner of the land if he just doesn't get to understand? It makes me more suspicious that Featherstone has no intention, that this is just another bluff. What he intends to do with his land, no idea. None whatsoever. So today, we begin on page 136. We are paragraph, well, I suppose technically speaking, paragraph 4, because the first paragraph is actually the end of something from page 135. At any rate, we shall start reading. We're with Fred Vincy. He had longed not only to be set free from his uncle, but also to find Mary Garth. She was now in her usual place by the fire, with sewing in her hands and a book open on a little table by her side. Her eyelids had lost some of their redness now, and she had her usual air of self-command. "Am I wanted upstairs?" she said, half rising as Fred entered. "No, I am only dismissed, because Simmons is gone up." Mary sat down again and resumed her work. She was certainly treating him with more indifference than usual. She did not know how affectionately indignant he had felt on her behalf upstairs. "May I stay here a little, Mary, or shall I bore you?" "Pray, sit down," said Mary. "You will not be so heavy a bore as Mr. John Wall, who was here yesterday, and he sat down without asking my leave. Poor fellow, I think he is in love with you. I am not aware of it, and to me it is one of the most odious things in a girl's life that there must always be some supposition of falling in love coming between her and any man who is kind to her and to whom she is grateful. I should have thought that I at least might have been safe from all that. I have no ground for the nonsensical vanity of fancying everybody who comes near me is in love with me. Now, you'll see from the page photographs that I had a wonderful time coloring this section, and it'll get even better. Just wait. You haven't seen the coloring yet. And that's because so much was interesting me. I'll tell you several different lines of investigation that I was doing through this whole section of text. First of all, this is a conversation between people who, how should I put it? We'll talk about this more. But suffice it to say for now, this is a conversation between two people who I think have some feelings for each other, but cannot be 100% honest about those feelings. And because of that, they are dropping hints at each other, saying things that go in favor of being affectionate, but also say things that are contradicting having any affection in order to make sure they protect the feelings that they're trying not to express to each other. I guess that's the best way to put it. We will talk more. But when you see blue, when you see sort of baby blue, those are phrases that I think are contributing to the discouraging of affection or are indicating a lack of affection. And anything which I put in sort of scarlet red, it isn't sort of scarlet red, it is scarlet. That's what the pencil says on it anyway. Anything in scarlet red is affirmative of affection or underlining affection, stressing affection in some way, being positively affectionate. So you can see here, for example, there's passages, he longed to find Mary Garth, not just wanted. That's a strong word. Longed to find Mary Garth. And then you get Fred commenting on the fact that John Wall sat down with Mary the other day without asking her leave. And he says, "Oh, I think he is in love with you." Now, I doubt very much that Fred is really unless he honestly sees John as a rival for his affections, but he's not indicated that yet in the book, and he still doesn't seem to be. The fact that he can hint at John being in love, I put here, perhaps Fred's rival for money and love. Well, maybe for money. I don't know. Fred doesn't show any kind of awareness the way Mrs. Wall does, John's mother, because, of course, we remember her conversation with Mr. Featherstone. She's very, very worried where Mr. Featherstone's inheritance is going to go. She does not like the idea that it will go to Fred Vincy. At any rate, so you see that. Then what you will also see, but you haven't seen it yet, is Fred's inclination to use the word if. And that's in orange. You will see me circling the word and coloring it in orange every time he says, this could be like this if, or if this were like this, then. In other words, always this conditional situation. Not the way things are, but how they could be if. And we'll note that. And I think that's all the sort of thing. And then, of course, there's a couple of very interesting phrases that Mary Garth uses that I really have to point out. There's some literary stuff. This is a very rich passage. At first, when I read it, I thought, oh, there's not much here. And then I thought, no, just study it as a lover's conversation. And I think there'll be more depth. So that's just giving you an idea of what to look for, what colors to look for as we move through this text. But before we go further, let's talk about Mary Garth. Let's talk about this phrase that she says, I should have thought that I, at least, might have been safe from all that, meaning safe from having anyone fall in love with her. She said, I have no ground for the nonsensical vanity of fancying everybody who comes near me is in love with me. Why does Mary say that? Well, we know from the previous chapters when Mary and Rosamond are together, it's made quite clear which one of them is the more conventionally beautiful. And the reason I'm pointing this out now, even though we've already mentioned it, is that I see in Mary Garth more similarities with George Eliot herself than perhaps I had been assuming previously, that Dorothea Brooke was the character that Eliot was kind of getting, because Eliot does kind of get behind her female protagonists, I think. I think she does kind of slip. I can't speak for her male ones. I can speak for Maggie Tulliver and Dorothea Brooke. And there are elements of Elliot in both those characters, but not entirely. And I think Mary Garth strikes me as also a character who has a lot of Elliot in her, the real George Eliot. And I'm going to quote from an article written by, let me just look up the author's name, Nicola Conradt. It's Kunrat, you might pronounce it. It's Coonradt. I couldn't find anything that would pronounce her name. So I'm going to say it's Kunrad, and we'll go with that, but it might not be correct. At any rate, she is an independent scholar, which sounds like my idea of a dream job, and she got her PhD from the University of Denver. And she wrote an article which is published in JSTOR, so obviously there'll be a link in the description box if you'd like to go read it. And she's talking about just how many similarities there are between Mary Garth and George Eliot, a significant amount. I'm reading now from Kunrad's article. The narrator, however, tells us that, quote, at the age of 22, Mary had certainly not attained that perfect good sense and good principle which are usually recommended to the less fortunate girl, as if they were to be obtained in quantities ready mixed with a flavour of resignation as required. We remember that quote from when Mary and Rosamond were together. And Kunrat goes on to say, here, the reader might wonder how Eliot would have such insight into this particular sensibility. How would Eliot know this? As physically unattractive herself, Kunrat says, Henry James famously called Eliot deliciously hideous. That doesn't help my feelings for Henry James. That's just changing the subject. Okay, and revealed in a letter to his father that, quote, in her vast ugliness resides a most powerful beauty which, in a very few minutes, steals forth and charms the mind, so that you end as I ended, in falling in love with her. Okay, I vindicated, Henry James vindicated. Eliot could certainly create the character Mary from her own painful experience as an ugly duckling whose mind becomes the beautiful swan. And Kunrat goes on to note a couple of other similarities between Mary Garth and George Eliot. First of all, I'll read this again straight from the article. Caleb Garth, like Eliot's own father, makes his living as an estate manager, placing the author's family on a very particular plane with the Garths. And that's important. Dorothea Brooke is actually socially above where George Eliot would have been, at least at that time when she was in her early 20s. She belonged more to the mercantile middle classes than she did to the upper classes when she was very young. I'm not sure if her status would have been the same when she was older. That I'll need to read more of her biography to be certain of that. But I think she still resided mainly with those who were better off in the middle classes. And then it shouldn't be overlooked the simple fact that Mary Garth, George Eliot's real name was Mary Ann Evans. But the other similarities, which Nicola doesn't talk about, but I noted, from reading Rosemary Ashton's biography, I know that in 1840, when Eliot was 19, she and her father moved into a new house so that her brother and his new wife could have the old family home where Eliot had grown up, because it was big enough for raising a family. And so Mary Ann Evans, i.e. George Eliot, moved in with her father to a smaller house in Coventry. And that meant that effectively Mary Ann, as the youngest daughter, was looking after her retired father. And that seemed to me also an interesting, similar situation to Mary Garth and old Mr. Featherston. Okay, that's uncle-niece, but nevertheless, it was still younger female relative looking after older male relative. And then on top of that, I do know that Mary Ann wasn't happy. And finally, Mary Garth and Mary Ann Evans, we don't know this shit, okay? So if you don't want spoilers for Middlemarch, I guess I should almost put up a little photographic interlude and say, put the mute on now, mute your sound now. Okay, for those not terribly worried, or those of you who've read Middlemarch 3-4 more times than I have, Mary Garth and Mary Ann Evans both have literary futures. They both become paid writers. And I think that all those similarities taken together make a strong case, I think, for George Eliot having inserted into Middlemarch a character most like herself at that age. Exactly how that resemblance will factor in to Middlemarch as a story, I don't know yet, but I'm going to put it out there because I think it'll be interesting as we get further and further into the book. And you can see these three dominant female characters. You can see Dorothea Brooke, that's established. I can't see how Rosamund Vincy will not be. Just the introduction of her and her very powerful beauty, I just think she's going to become something that matters in the book in one way or t'other. And then we have Mary, and I feel like Mary is going to be a third strong, outstanding female character, but that these three women are going to be very different. And so I'd be interested to see where at the end of the book these three are, and then it will be interesting to talk about them. So we will come back to that. But this scene that we're going to cover here, which is going to go to the end of chapter 14, is a conversation between Mary and Fred. And one thing I want to say before we go further with it is how much this conversation reminded me of several other literary conversations between person A and and someone who is significant to them. But the conversation isn't an entirely honest one. And it isn't entirely honest because it isn't time for honesty. The situation does not warrant honesty. And it's also, these are the sort of scenes which create the most sense of either frustration or yearning in the reader because they want honesty. They want resolution. They want the two people to come together. They believe they should be together. And the scenes I'm thinking of, and if any of these resonate with you, then you'll see what I mean. I'm thinking of Tartuffe, Molière's play. In Tartuffe, we have the characters of Valère and Marianne. And they actually are, or were, almost engaged to be married as the play opens. But unfortunately, Marianne's father, Orgon, has taken it into his head that what he will do, he is enraptured with a religious, you could call him a guru, a cult figure. But Orgon is completely given over in infatuation to this man and his ideas. And he thinks the kindest thing he could do for Tartuffe is to offer him Marianne, his daughter, as a wife. Nothing could be more awful for Marianne, but she doesn't know what to do about it because it is the 17th century when young women belonged to their fathers and they really didn't have a say in who they married. So there's an awful scene where Valère, her almost intended, learns that she's going to be married off to Tartuffe, and he comes to confront her in the house, and they have a conversation which it's anything but honest, because they have feelings for each other, but they fear that being honest about those feelings would be no use because they cannot be together, or that's how they fear it might be. So it's not exactly the same conversation as Mary and Fred are going to have, but you'll see, if you think of it just in terms of honesty, how honest is the conversation? I think you'll see a similarity. Also, we could think of the scene in Hamlet, Ophelia, and Act 3, Scene 2. This is the famous to be or not to be soliloquy scene. So Hamlet opens with that soliloquy, and then along comes Ophelia, who has been hiding somewhere where she can overhear him, and they begin to have a conversation. And she has his letters to her, and she tries to make him converse and talk to her about his feelings for her, and he denies everything. And it's a very strange conversation, not only on Hamlet's part, because you think you are lying, those are your letters, but it's also a deceitful conversation on Ophelia's part, because she is having it not because she wants it, but because her father has asked her have this conversation with Hamlet while he concealed somewhere so they can overhear the whole thing. So it's not a true lover's conversation. There's deceit on both sides. And that dishonesty keeps the two lovers from coming together at that point in time. And I think that's key. These are conversations between two people that you think should be together, but the nature of their conversation isn't honest, and because it isn't honest, their relationship cannot go forward. If you haven't read Tartuffe and you haven't read Hamlet, but Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, if you think of chapter 8, and this is where I'm not sure whether Elizabeth has literally just met Mr. Darcy for the first time. It's very early on in their acquaintance. I think she's already been snubbed by him at one dance. And now she's staying overnight at Netherfield House, Mr. Bingley's house, because Jane is there and Jane is not well. And Elizabeth has to amuse herself somehow in the evening, and so she goes down to the drawing room where she sees everyone else playing cards, and she's concerned about joining in because she thinks they might be betting high amounts of money, and she doesn't have that money. So she takes up a book and starts reading. And this starts a conversation which involves Elizabeth, but not much. Elizabeth is mostly listening to Mr. Darcy and the Bingley sisters discussing what an ideal woman should be. And Elizabeth coming in and sort of saying, well, if that's your idea of an ideal woman, I'm not surprised that you haven't found many of them yet, because that's a lot of demands. And it's an interesting conversation because although it's being honest, and although you couldn't say at this point that Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy have feelings for each other, you know, as a reader of Jane Austen, that her books go this way. Two people are going to get together. So this is still an interesting scene, because the two characters are trying to say something to each other and yet not trying to say too much, testing each other out. Also, I think in Pride and Prejudice especially, testing the ground. There is a further conversation, of course, when Jane goes to visit Charlotte in her home where she's now married, and of course Charlotte's husband happens to be the vicar in the parish that belongs to Mr. Darcy's aunt. This gets quite complicated. At any rate, Mr. Darcy does come down, and he comes down with a deliberate intention of seeing Elizabeth and telling her, I'm so sorry. In the length of time I've known you, I've tried to pretend I don't have feelings for you, but I do. Unfortunately, Elizabeth has incorrect information about Mr. Darcy's character, and that, combined with his coldness towards her on certain occasions, means that she responds to him very differently. And it's a horrible scene because she turns him down and she's very angry and he doesn't know what to do. And of course, it's followed by some letters where they try to repair it. But at that point, at that conversation itself, even though both characters are being honest, there's still an element of dishonesty because Elizabeth has incorrect information and Mr. Darcy does not at that point in time tell her that she has incorrect information. So while the conversation is going on, it fails to bring them together because of a dishonesty issue. So if most people have read Pride and Prejudice, so it's another scene that just helps you think this scene between Fred and Rosamond is like that. There is dishonesty going on one or the other's part, or it exists in there, and it's keeping them from coming together. If we go back to section 1, we will see that Fred does it a little bit when he talks about John Wall and he says, poor fellow, I think he is in love with you. He's not talking about John. I really don't think. I think what he's doing is trying to introduce the subject of his own love. And he wants to do that because he knows that Rosamond and Mary had a conversation in which Mary said she would not marry him even if he asked, and that's bothering him. And he wants some clarity because he really does want to marry Mary. And I think that's why Mary's response to, I think he is in love with you, isn't really to talk about John Wall and his feelings. It's to go, oh, I'm so tired of all these people thinking that if you do some little thing for me, you're in love with me, or I should think that you're in love with me. And she's really talking to Fred without talking about Fred. Because it says, as we begin section 2, Mary did not mean to betray a feeling, but in spite of herself, she ended in a tremulous tone of vexation. And the vexation is because she probably anticipates where this conversation is going. It's a conversation that they've no doubt had before or something close to it. And she's going, here he goes again. I'm going to have to start this fight all over. And so she's vexed. Fred says, confound John Wall. There's nothing to do with John Wall, but He then says, I did not mean to make you angry. I didn't know you had any reason for being grateful to him. I forgot what a great service you think it if anyone snuffs a candle for you. Fred also had his pride. Now, see, Eliot's narrator is explaining. He's saying this because he knows that Mary's having a go at him, and he's just trying to say, ooh, he's trying to dig back at her, and that's why I've colored his phrase in blue. He's countering her. So it says, Fred also had his pride and was not going to show that he knew what had called forth this outburst of Mary's. So they both know. Effectively, that little section there is saying both people know what they really want to say, but you're not going to hear it said, not straight out. Mary replies, oh, I am not angry except with the ways of the world. I do like to be spoken to as if I had common sense. I really often feel as if I could understand a little more than I hear even from young gentlemen who have been to college. Mary had recovered, and she spoke with a suppressed, rippling undercurrent of laughter, pleasant to hear. I've underlined that in red because she's changing her tone a little bit. She doesn't want this conversation to get too negative. Neither of them do, really. Neither of them want to tell each other, I hate you, I never want to see you again. But at the same time, Mary is trying to keep the conversation from becoming too seriously emotive. I don't care how merry you are at my expense this morning, said Fred. I thought you looked so sad when you came upstairs. It is a shame you should stay here to be bullied in that way. Oh, I have an easy life, by comparison. I have tried being a teacher, but I am not fit for that. My mind is too fond of wandering on its own way. I think any hardship is better than pretending to do what one is paid for and never really doing it. Everything here I can do as well as anyone else could, perhaps better than some. Rosie, for example, though she is just the sort of beautiful creature that is imprisoned with ogres in fairy tales. So we see the first of Fred's ifs. I forget what a great service you think it if anyone snuffs a candle for you. To be honest, this isn't one of the ifs that I really want to zero in on, because most of Fred's ifs are talking about himself. I would be like this if. This would be this if. So they're mostly talking about himself and what would make everything better in his life. And we'll come to those. I underlined and really colored in this section here where Mary says, I think any hardship is better than pretending to do what one is paid for and never really doing it. And she talks about that with teaching, and I can sympathize because I think it often happens, especially even now, with women who are interested in literature and books. Myself, for example, when I was taking my English literature degree, and I went and consulted some of the pages on the Open University website with career guidance. And really, it was like teacher or nothing. And I thought, and I knew too, I think in sympathy with Mary Garth, I thought, no, teaching isn't exactly what is good for me. Even though you might say, I suppose, well, you're teaching now. And I thought, I am, but I'm not, because there isn't anything two-way. I think a good teacher, surely, is someone interested in the two-way experience. If you don't just talk, you listen and you react to what you hear. And I've always felt like Mary, my mind wanders too much, goes where it wants to go. And that means that the person I'm teaching, if they can't get on without help, they're at a loss. So I never felt that I was cut out to be a teacher either. And that's a side point. Mary is saying that she isn't. I just think it's interesting that she says it'd be better to suffer hardship than to pretend to do something that you're not really doing. And I thought, okay, do I think that's entirely true in every situation? I think the majority of people, no, let me talk about the minority. I think there is a minority of human beings who are very fortunate, and the work they get to do is work they really, truly want to do. It is what they sought out. It is what they choose. And those people often say that their job doesn't feel like a job. It feels more like a hobby. And that's great. But I think the majority of human beings, we, to some degree or another, do a job because we have a mortgage, we have children, we have other responsibilities and people to look after, and we know that we must go get something called paid employment to cover that. And that doesn't mean that our paid employment can't be pleasant, can't be a good place to be, but that is still different than doing something you truly have a passion for. You can be good at what you do as paid employment, and yet know in your heart of hearts that had you truly a choice, and there I'm almost using an if phrase myself, if you had a true choice, if you were really, truly free, or if you'd made a choice at the right time, that's the better way to put it. If you made the right choices at the right time, you might be doing something else. I think most of us end up in that situation. I don't think it's bad, but Fred will think it's bad. And obviously Mary is saying, absolutely don't do it. But it's interesting that she says that. So in other words, what she is doing with Mr. Featherston, by her own admission, is something she doesn't really want to do. And yet she's choosing it. She'd rather do it because it's something she can do rather than just pretending to do. She has lots of time for her own thoughts and the workings of her own mind. And so she'd prefer that. And I get that. I think there are jobs that you have that aren't so mentally demanding, and so you can do them quite competently, and yet there's space for you to be you outside of work. And I love how Mary compared Rosamond to a fairy tale character who would be the more natural companion for an old ogre. I thought, oh my goodness, she's just called Featherston an ogre without actually naming him. I think very clever. And of course, Fred is really shocked. I don't know exactly what he's shocked. Perhaps because she called Rosie a beautiful creature, because Fred goes, "Rosie," cried Fred, in a tone of profound brotherly skepticism. "Come, Fred," said Mary emphatically. "You have no right to be critical." And she really does stress that you have no right to be critical, which makes him come back and say, "Do you mean anything particular just now?" And she has to deny it, because I think she is. Why else would she say you if she didn't mean something in particular to Fred? She says, "No, I mean something general, always." I don't believe that. Neither does Fred, because he thinks, let's go straight to the issue, shall we? "Oh, that I am idle and extravagant. Well, I am not fit to be a poor man. I should not have made a bad fellow if I had been rich." Mary says, "You would have done your duty in that state of life to which it has not pleased God to call you," said Mary, laughing. Good joke. And I colored that in red because she's trying to lighten things a little. Fred says, "Well, I couldn't do my duty as a clergyman any more than you could do yours as a governess. You ought to have a little fellow feeling there, Mary. I never said you ought to be a clergyman. There are other sorts of work. It seems to me very miserable not to resolve on some course and act accordingly. So I could, if—" Fred broke off and stood up, leaning against the mantelpiece. For some reason, he was about to say something. Maybe he was about to be too honest. "If you were sure you should not have a fortune?" "I did not say that. You want to quarrel with me. It is too bad of you to be guided by what other people say about me. How can I want to quarrel with you? I should be quarreling with all my new books," said Mary, lifting the volume on the table. "However naughty you may be to other people, you are good to me, because I like you better than anyone else. But I know you despise me." "Yes, I do, a little," said Mary, nodding with a smile. "You would admire a stupendous fellow who would have wise opinions about everything." "Yes, I should." Mary was sewing swiftly and seemed provokingly mistress of the situation. When a conversation has taken a wrong turn for us, we only get farther and farther into the swamp of awkwardness. This was what Fred Vincy felt. And Fred, you could argue that he should stop here. He should just not keep trying to argue with Mary, because she is in the dominant position. She is running this argument better than he is, but he wants this so badly. So we read on. I suppose a woman is never in love with anyone she has always known, ever since she can remember, as a man often is. It is always some new fellow who strikes a girl. Let me see, said Mary, the corners of her mouth curling archly. I must go back on my experience. There is Juliet. She seems an example of what you say, but then Ophelia had probably known Hamlet a long while, and Brenda Troyle. She had known Mordaunt Merton ever since they were children, but then he seems to have been an estimable young man. And Mina was still more deeply in love with Cleveland, who was a stranger. Waverley was new to Flora MacIver, but then she did not fall in love with him. And there are Olivia and Sophia Primrose and Corinne. They may be said to have fallen in love with new men. Altogether, my experience is rather mixed. Mary looked up with some roguishness at Fred, and that look of hers was very dear to him, though the eyes were nothing more than clear windows where observation sate laughingly. He was certainly an affectionate fellow, and as he had grown from boy to man, he had grown in love with his old playmate, notwithstanding that share in higher education of the country, which had exalted his views of rank and income. This section, where Mary comments on all her books, it's a lovely way of saying how much she loves Fred without saying it. By going through all the books that obviously have come to her through him, her experience, the experience that she has in love, if it's all literary, if it's all vicarious through book characters, it comes to her courtesy of Fred. She's underlining what she said at the top of the page. How can I want to quarrel with you? I should be quarreling with all my new books. Let's look at those characters, though. Obviously, Juliet, she's talking about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. She's also talking about Shakespeare with Ophelia and Hamlet. Then we have Brenda Troyle and Mordaunt Merton. Now she starts talking about Sir Walter Scott, his Waverley novel. She's read The Pirate, because that's where Brenda and Mordaunt come from. And then further on, it talks about Mina and Cleveland. They are also mentioned in The Pirate. And then further down, we've got Waverley and Flora MacIver. That's from the novel Waverley by Sir Walter Scott. So she's read 2 Walter Scotts. Then she goes back into the 18th century. She's talking about Olivia and Sophia Primrose. They were from The Vicar of Wakefield by Oliver Goldsmith. And then she talks about Corinne, a novel written by Madame de Staël in the late 18th century. All of these well-known books. So Fred is introducing her really to some of the bestsellers, current bestsellers, but also long-running bestsellers, because I believe Corinne would have been written in the 1780s, 1790s. Similarly, Vicar of Wakefield, that kind of time. Sir Walter Scott, around the turn of the century. So the books would already have been a couple of decades old, but still selling well. So he's really giving her a good foundation for her reading. And there's a moment in that final paragraph in the section where it says, Mary looked up with some roguishness at Fred, and that look of hers was very dear to him. You then understand just how long their affection has built. Very slowly, it started as just little children who play together because they're related, they're cousins. And then as he gets older and older, his affection for her just continues to grow. It's a very solid sounding kind of affection. And I can have some sympathy with Fred, that even though he's not in the best place right now to be getting married, the affection that he feels for Mary, I think, is well grounded. It is it's not an infatuation. It seems like something that is slowly growing. And I'm wondering if on Mary's side, that feeling is mutual and also spent time growing. But as we've said, they can't be honest about that love. And this next section, which is number 5, as I've numbered it on these pages, the conversation begins to get quite silly, quite repetitive, quite covering the same ground again, but not getting anywhere. But we'll read through it for its own sake. When a man is not loved, it is no use for him to say that he could be a better fellow, could do anything. I mean, if he were sure of being loved in return. Not of the least use in the world for him to say he could be better, might, could, would. They are contemptible auxiliaries. I don't see how a man is to be good for much unless he has some one woman to love him dearly. I think the goodness should come before he expects that. You know better, Mary. Women don't love their men for their goodness. Perhaps not, but if they love them, they never think them bad. It is hardly fair to say I am bad. I said nothing at all about you. I never shall be good for anything, Mary, if you will not say that you love me, if you will not promise to marry me, I mean when I am able to marry. If I did love you, I would not marry you. I certainly would not promise ever to marry you. I think that is quite wicked, Mary. If you love me, you ought to promise to marry me. On the contrary, I think it would be wicked in me to marry you, even if I did love you. You mean just as I am, without any means of maintaining a wife? Of course, I am but 23. In that last point you will alter, but I am not so sure of any other alteration. My father says an idle man ought not to exist, much less be married. Then am I to blow my brains out? No. On the whole, I should think you would do better to pass your examination. I have heard Mr. Fairbrother say it is disgracefully easy. That is all very fine. Anything is easy to him. Not that cleverness has anything to do with it. I am 10 times cleverer than many men who pass. Dear me, said Mary, unable to repress her sarcasm. That accounts for the curates like Mr. Krause. Divide your cleverness by 10, and the quotient, dear me, is able to take a degree. But that only shows you are 10 times more idle than the others. Well, if I did pass, you would not want me to go into the church? That is not the question. What I want you to do, you have a conscience of your own, I suppose. There. Oh, there is Mr. Lidgett. I must go tell my uncle. I found myself thinking there are times when I didn't agree with what either person was saying, but I think mainly with Fred's arguments, the things that he says, when a man is not loved, you think, loved by who? Loved by, does it have to be a particular person's love? Is it awful if his friends and family love him, but he can't find this singular woman to love him, or doesn't love himself? I think that is more at the root of Fred's issue here. There is a distinct lack of self-love, oddly enough, perhaps because Eliot does say, she talks about him going to higher education and getting these ideas about rank and income. I wonder if that time at university dented his self-esteem and his self-love. I wonder if his fellow students contributed to that, because they would have looked down on him, all those sons of aristocratic families, this manufacturer's son coming to Oxford, of all things. He may have had a tough time of it. Sorry, it wasn't Oxford, it was Cambridge, wasn't it? At any rate, it wouldn't have mattered which of the universities he went to. Either way, he would have had a tough time. He would have had a tough time. His status would have been pointed out to him more than once. And I can understand if that has dented his confidence and made him struggle now to be the person that perhaps he was before he went to university. Or more ridiculous, when he says, I've written it down here. He says, women don't love their men for their goodness. I thought, one can only speak personally, right? But you can all speak personally. Anyone who's been in a relationship, your significant other, I mean, is part of the reason you love them because you think of them as reasonably good. I know that there's a literary trope for people getting involved with bad people romantically. But I think for most of us who stay in relationships, it is because the person that we're with, we think is a pretty decent person. They're okay. I mean, if they weren't. Or worse, when Mary says, no, I don't think I can marry you because I don't think you're going to change. And then all he says is, am I to blow my brains out? I thought, no, Fred, It's almost as if Fred is saying, I can't change. I need something external to be different before I can change. And it's interesting that he's doing that. If he were in therapy, I think a therapist would say to him, you need to think differently. You can't see the external world as needing to move before you can. You need to do some moving, some changing first. You will then find the external looks a little different. But this last section we're going to read has got to demonstrate, if Fred is a good person, then unfortunately this is a demonstration of some of his worst behavior. Mary, said Fred, seizing her hand as she rose, if you will not give me some encouragement, I shall get worse instead of better. I will not give you any encouragement, said Mary, reddening. Your friends would dislike it, and so would mine. My father would think it a disgrace to me if I accepted a man who got into debt and would not work. Fred was stung and released her hand. She walked to the door, but there she turned and said, Fred, you have always been so good, so generous to me. I am not ungrateful, but never speak to me in that way again. Very well, said Fred, sulkily, taking up his hat and whip. His complexion showed patches of pale pink and dead white. Like many a plucked, idle young gentleman, he was thoroughly in love, and with a plain girl who had no money. But having Mr. Featherstone's land in the background, and a persuasion that let Mary say what she would, she really did care for him, Fred was not utterly in despair. When he got home, he gave 4 of the 20s to his mother, asking her to keep them from him. I don't want to spend that money, Mother. I want it to pay a debt with, so keep it safe away from my fingers. Bless you, my dear, said Mrs. Vincey. She doted on her eldest son and her youngest girl, a child of 6, whom others thought her 2 naughtiest children. The mother's eyes are not always deceived in their partiality. She, at least, can best judge who is the tender, filial-hearted child, and Fred was certainly very fond of his mother. Perhaps it was his fondness for another person also that made him particularly anxious to take some security against his own liability to spend the £100, for the creditor to whom he owed 160 held a firmer security in the shape of a bill signed by Mary's father. The surprise of who Fred actually owes money to and how much. So he's short by £60, a debt that he owes Mary's father. Oh my! That makes his bad behavior in this section even worse. It's like, Fred, you owe her father 100. You can't marry her. You can't extract a promise from her. You shouldn't be trying. You should be doing everything in your power to pay that debt. You've got to do it. If you love her, that is something that hasn't been discussed. Fred keeps talking about, if you love me, if you love me, if you love me, if you love me. He does. Mary never counters by saying, if you love me. She makes a point about what has to happen, but she makes it very pragmatically and practically. She doesn't hinge her love on what Fred does or doesn't do. She simply says, this isn't the right situation. You are not the right kind of person for me to say yes to. It just isn't a good idea. So she's leaving it in the realm of the pragmatic and the down-to-earth. She's never getting her emotions involved, and she's very good like that. Better, perhaps, than Fred, who's wearing his heart on his sleeve. I mean, he's taken it off his sleeve and he's flapping it about. He doesn't know how to hold back and just and think practically. He doesn't seem to want to think practically. He's got a very dreamy, emotive way to him, and there's strength to that, because he does honestly seem to have true, tender feelings to Mary, and I think the two of them would make a good couple just as soon as Fred gets a grip on some kind of thinking and action habits that will make him more reliable, someone that can be depended upon, and someone that understands just the pragmatic everyday things, which at the moment he's been able to avoid. And I am sure, without even looking at all my clips, that I have talked long enough. Thanks so much, everybody. Really enjoyed this segment, and I'm looking forward to Middlemarch March and seeing how much I can keep up with the content I promised to give you, which is every Sunday a meditation, and then in the middle of the week, something still to do with George Eliot and or Middlemarch that I'm reading as nonfiction. Cross your fingers for me, because it is quite ambitious, and the only break that we probably will have is around about the 21st of March, and that is because on the 21st of March, 2 years ago, I posted my first video on YouTube, and I'm quite sort of, because I can't believe that we've reached this anniversary, but we have. And so I have a special, unique little tag that I'm going to do around about that date. I'm not going to say any more. I talk too much, just like Fred, so I'm not going to say any more. I'm going to just shut up now, say, everybody, have a great week's reading, and I will see you again sometime in the middle of the week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.